Okay, so dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, let me welcome you and see you. My name is Zsolt Enyedi. I am a political scientist teaching in Vienna and researching liberalism here in Budapest at CEU's Democracy Institute. Today, we will be addressing various questions of politics, philosophy, sociology, and so on. But this is also a day of the launching conference of a new project. So let me say a few words about this project. The title is Neo-Authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response. It is financed by the European Union and by the British government. It's supposed to run for 3 years, and it has 8 partner institutions: University of Vienna, Scuola Normale Superiore, the German Marshall Fund, University of Oxford, Central European University, the Polish University of Social Sciences and Humanities, and the Charles University. We try to address a question that is probably in everybody's mind, and it is: how did the ideological landscape change around us in the last 2 decades? The relatively simple intuition behind our grand proposal was that this landscape has changed radically, that the liberal democratic vision fragmented, and that the supporters of liberal democracy became diffident and authoritarian, and illiberal alternatives gained traction. Now, this process is typically understood and described as one of polarization between liberal and populist forces. And well, this image has quite some factual backing, but it has the unfortunate side effect that it leads us to portray the opponents of illiberalism in a somewhat schematic way. We tend to think of them as being misogynic, racist, disgruntled, religiously fundamentalist, homophobic, Putin supporters who are also against environment protection. Or the other option is to think of them as non-ideological kleptocrats and their clients. Our project has a different starting point. Our working hypothesis is that the liberal democratic model can be questioned from many angles, and that those who challenge liberal democracy, they have ideologically well-interpretable claims, and that these claims also come with policy-relevant proposals. So there is something to study there, particularly because these challenges are also embedded in established intellectual traditions, or at least react to such traditions. And therefore, we have historians in our team. Now, when it comes to the way we try to address these issues, I have to admit that the project is so complex that even I sometimes lose track of it. We will, first of all, do very serious text analysis. We will look at party manifestos. We will look at speeches of politicians, rules and regulations, and discussions of ordinary people and activists on Twitter and Facebook. And we will subject all these texts to various qualitative and quantitative methods. Then we will do surveys. We will run new 7 or 8 surveys in various European countries. We will also have an experimental segment of these surveys in order to see how people react to various ideological arguments and narratives developed by us, but we will also try to match ideological position to social groups. Then we will do proper laboratory experiments where we will study emotions and the role of emotions in making illiberal alternatives attractive. We will use expert surveys to classify political actors, but we will go beyond the world of institutionalized politics, and we will convene so-called mini-publics in the framework of which ordinary citizens, educators, activists, both left and right, will interact with each other and respond to our stimuli. So as you can see, there are many methods employed, and all these methods are supposed to provide us with data set that can be integrated and can provide us with a map, ideological map of Europe, and particularly the 7 countries that we will be focusing on. Historians will be asked to help us to understand the roots of the current configurations, and we will have philosophers whose primary job will be to think about the normative boundaries of the legitimate responses against the illiberal challenge, that is, to answer the thorny question of whether intolerance can be tolerated. I think nobody is as qualified as Michael Ignatieff to give a keynote address at the launching conference of our project. Michael is an eminent historian, an authority on issues that are very central to our projects, like nationalism, human rights, liberalism. As a historian of political thought and ideas, he's perhaps best known as the interpreter of Isaiah Berlin. But if you look at his latest book on consolation, Finding Solace in Dark Times, then you will see an astonishingly wide intellectual horizon, from Cicero to Karl Marx, from St. Paul to Anna Akhmatova, and so on. We asked him to give this presentation also because he is one of those astute observers of political ideas and arguments who is at the same time very sensitive to emotions. And this is something that you can also see in his latest publication, The Politics of Enemies, that just came out with the Journal of Democracy. And of course, we welcome him because there was a time when he was the master of this ship, that is a CEU, in the midst of the worst storms. So it's particularly good feeling to see him back. Come. Good.
It is good to be back. It's emotional to be back. It's fitting to begin a project on neo-authoritarianism in a university whose fate illustrates why neo-authoritarianism is a real problem. A neo-authoritarian regime is the kind of regime that expels a university. It's not just a conservative right-wing institution. It's a regime that bends and breaks the law in order to achieve its goals. And I never want to portray CU as a victim. We've been through a lot together. And I hope we've come out stronger, and we refuse to be the victims of this story. But we illustrate the story. We illustrate why neo-authoritarianism is a real challenge to values that we care about: academic freedom, free discussion, plural disagreements, the things that this university stood for. So when Zsolt asked me to talk to you, I knew I couldn't say no, and I can't say no to Zsolt anyway, because he's one of the luminaries of our institution, one of the people who's most productive, most passionately committed to what we do. And I think all of us in the university should take enormous pride in the fact that he's got this whopping great grant in a highly competitive process. It does credit to him and to his team. Some of you are here, but it also does enormous credit to the university. So thank you. I've been asked. My provocative title is Why We Should Care About Democracy at All. And I put that question because it seems to me the neo-authoritarian challenge has forced that question upon us. What do I understand the neo-authoritarian challenge to be? I think there are four elements that I see clearly. One is that neo-authoritarians have moved from the fringes of the political system into power itself. It's not just Orban, but it's also Poland. It's not just Meloni's Italy, it's now Sweden. 4 out of 27 governments in the European Union now have parties in power who might or might not, that's an empirical question, fit the definition of being neo-authoritarian. So suddenly this challenge is not on the margins, but at the center. We then have to define neo-authoritarianism very carefully. And I think the project will want to be very clear about the line between right-wing conservatism that remains firmly constitutional and a neo-authoritarian conservatism that seeks basically to use a democratic mandate to alter the constitution in some way. Orban fits a neo-authoritarian model because he isn't simply conservative and right-wing. He's actually gerrymandered the constitution to essentially ensure single-party rule in perpetuity. And it remains, there's some of that going on in Poland, constitutional gerrymandering, particularly in relation to the Constitutional Court. And it remains to be seen whether when the Swedish Democrats are in that coalition in Sweden, they begin to pull the Swedish constitution out of shape. Until that point, they're just right-wing conservatives. And provided they're constitutional, liberal progressives may not be happy with their agenda, but hey, that's politics. When you're a neo-authoritarian, your agenda is to change the rules of the game. It seems to me is one. I'm trying to be helpful to the project, and the project may simply say, no, that's not right, Michael, leave us alone, but I want to put that out anyway as my suggestion. Neo-authoritarians claim a democratic mandate from the people and then use a democratic mandate to change the rules of the game. That would be what it seems to me is the area that is critical. The third element is that they're challenging a liberal democratic vision of democracy. My kind of one-sentence definition of what liberal democracy is that it's power balancing power to keep the people free. That is, it's majority rule balanced by counter-majoritarian constitutions, independent judiciaries, free media, and crucially, I would add free universities. I've argued for years that we need to think of universities as counter-majoritarian institutions, not in the sense that they don't seek to serve the people and be responsible to the popular will, especially if they're state-funded, but that their role is always to question received opinion, to validate the knowledge that society uses to make public choice, and where necessary, to say that the knowledge being used for public choice is just wrong. And that makes this a counter-majoritarian institution. What is significant about the neo-authoritarian challenge is its full frontal attack on these counter-majoritarian institutions, the Constitutional Court, a free press, universities. It's an attack that's at once constitutional, and it's taken constitutional form in Hungary, but it's also cultural and social. It's an attack on liberal progressive gatekeepers who it is argued have an unelected privilege to dictate cultural and social norms to an unwilling majority. And so it's an attack that has a constitutional dimension, but crucially a social and cultural dimension as well. The final element of the neo-authoritarian challenge, obviously, is that it's geostrategic. You can't understand Orban, you can't understand the developments in Italy without being aware of Russia and China, the sense that there is a geostrategic competition at the cultural level in which Russia and China are not merely saying we contest NATO, we contest the Americans' geostrategic influence. We're also contesting the model, the sense that the free world incarnated in liberal democratic institutions is the model of the future. The neo-authoritarians in Europe are, in some sense, in uneasy relation to the big geostrategic blocs that are mounting a legal, geostrategic, cultural, and social challenge to the global hegemony of the United States and the democratic model that it supposedly stands for. And you put all of this together, and you begin to see that it forces those of us who believe in liberal democracy to ask ourselves my opening question, which is, why do we care about democracy at all? What idea of democracy are we actually defending? Why is the public, this is, I think, a really difficult question for us, why is the public in at least 4 European countries lending such an ear to this vision of democracy? And how do we respond to the neo-authoritarian challenge before it uses democracy to destroy democracy itself? So this is the context in which I think going back to basics and asking ourselves what it is about democracy we actually care about is the right question to ask. It requires me, I think, to talk about what one of the great figures of this university, and he's in the room, so I feel kind of nervous because he's such an authority to me. Janos Kish calls the democratic ideal. What is the democratic ideal? I think there are 2 elements that I want to single out. One aspect of the democratic ideal relates to the connection between equality, legitimacy, and consent. I mean, if democracy were only a way of making collective decisions, if it was just a set of procedures, we wouldn't care about it, and some people wouldn't be willing to die for it. Our question always is why people are prepared to die for democracy at some level. And that's a complicated question, but it's a question being answered daily, about 6 or 7 hours from us. So they're not dying for a decision procedure. They're dying because it says something about them that they value enough to put their lives at hazard. And so that's, I think, what we need to understand. My sense is that we care about democracy because it says something so important about us. It's as if democracy addresses us and defines us in a way that reflects what we most passionately want to believe about ourselves. One is that everyone is equal and everyone has, each one counts for one and no one counts for more than one. Bentham's great definition of this. That ideal each one counts for one and no one counts for more than one, that basic egalitarian premise is constitutive of the democratic ideal for us. And it is also secondarily the basis of consent. That is, it is a form of authority and power which says nothing is legitimate until we give consent. And the consent that is being given is by all of us. This, as we know, wasn't the way it started. Democracy started by excluding half of the people in this room. And it is only since after the First World War that all of the people in this room were included in the democratic ideal. But to the degree that the democratic ideal has become universal, it is that ideal of the relationship between equality and consent that moves us. It speaks to us. It says, this is who you are. And that aspect of democracy seems to me to be tremendously important. And the phrase, each counts for one and no one counts for more than one, the word counts is worth dwelling on. Because the word counts makes an extraordinarily radical assumption about all of us, which is that each of us has the rational capacity to choose and make decisions in matters of enormous importance. The premise of democracy is a premise about our rationality as individual agents. We all know, and we're troubled by it, that we're not as rational as we purport to be, not as sensible as we hope. We're more emotional than we think they are. But the democratic premise is that all of us, when asked, can make ultimate choices about peace and war, about distributive justice, on the basis of our decision-making as individuals. No other system of government makes that claim about our equality and our rationality, but it is decisively what appeals to us about the democratic appeal. It describes us in a way that we passionately want to believe is true. I'll get to whether it is true. I'll get to the gulf between the ideal and the reality. But that, I think, is the beginning of why we care about democracy. We care for another reason, which is then connected between the ideal and the real. We care about democracy because the reality of democracy is so damn disappointing. If that's the premise, each one counts for one and no one counts for more than one, we know, in the words of Bob Dylan, that money doesn't just talk, it screams in our political systems. So we know immediately that some people count a hell of a lot more than others. And we know from our own internal discussions about our own rationality, that's always a tough conversation, how far we fall short of the rational criteria that each one of us is sovereign in our judgment, sovereign in our capacity to choose, sufficiently capable to make these choices. And I think that's a crucial element of our experience of democracy, that it is an ideal that defines us as we wish to be, and we know at the same time how far short we fall. It's not merely the system that falls short, how far we fall short of incarnating the virtues that the democratic ideal we also then know, to get down to the institutions, that liberal democracy, based as it is on representation, not direct democracy, but on representation, we know that we elect representatives over whom we have very little control. We know in turn, and I've been an MP, so I know this is burned onto my back like a brand, how little power our representatives have over the democratic process, how much power has been centralized by executive authority. And so the consent we give once every 4 years is exceedingly hollow. This symbolic moment in which we are recognized as equals and in which we are recognized for our rationality happens once. And then somehow it's as if the democratic process is taken away from us. And that is a source of discontent and unhappiness. Promises are constantly made to us by our governors that of democratic accountability and transparency, that they owe us an explanation of what they're doing, and that's almost always violated in liberal democratic states. And so one of the bitter meanings of why do we care about democracy at all is we feel betrayed. One of the reasons we care about democracy is we feel betrayed. We feel that the ideal is being betrayed. There's a dynamic here. It's not merely that the ideal is a kind of distant, unapproachable, and wouldn't it be nice to get there? No, it's much sharper than that. The sense that democracy promises something which it is never delivering or only imperfectly delivering. So the care is related to a sense of betrayal. Okay, that's something about the first aspect of the democratic ideal, which is the relationship between democracy, equality, legitimacy, and consent. The second aspect of what makes the democratic ideal so appealing but also so tormenting is its connection between democracy, sovereignty, and self-determination. The first ideal addresses us as individuals. What we like is the idea that we're being interpolated as rational individuals capable of sovereign choice, and the idea that the entire edifice of legitimacy reposes on that assumption. But the second one, sovereignty and self-determination, addresses us as members of communities. And it offers us something that is equally precious to us, the capacity to find what this collectivity stands for. And the idea that this collectivity should be master or mistress in its own house. The deep connection, in other words, between democracy and national self-determination. And in the civic definitions of nationalism, the two come together. We are masters in our own house, and our constitutional situation recognizes us as equal rights-bearing individuals. That's a kind of civic nationalist definition of political community, in which we achieve mastery of our own house, and at the same time, we're interpolated and instantiated as subjects who are equal and equally rational. There is, as you know, other forms of nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and the relationship between democracy and nationalism is explosive. The first time I met democracy in this part of the world at the end of the Cold War, I met it in the Balkans. When democracy came to the Balkans, it was ethnic majority rule, which meant ethnic cleansing, which meant war, which meant hatred, and made killing. So the relationship between democracy and self-determination is inherently explosive. The question is, who belongs in that national community? And we have an enormous stake in, as liberals and progressives, in the idea that the democratic community that is supposed to be master of the house, that everybody belongs in the house. regardless of race and color and creed. It's a matter of allegiance, of commitment to democratic ideals, not a matter of birth and skin color, race, or religion. And we have been battling out these competing definitions of democracy ever since. But it's crucial for a liberal Democrat who's a proud civic nationalist, as I am, to acknowledge the uncomfortable fact that the other side of the argument, the ethnic nationalist side, the nasty nationalist side, is deeply and bitterly convinced that they are democratic, that they are speaking for a majority. And so that's a thing we need to think about. Now, one of the issues when I talked about the first aspect of equality, legitimacy, and consent, I said that we feel betrayed by the gulf between the ideal and the reality. But the same thing is true in relation to sovereignty and self-determination, the other aspect of the democratic ideal. A liberal Democrat has felt since the European Union came into being that we could be masters in our own house by pooling sovereignty, by combining sovereignty in ways that would not be zero-sum. That is, we would have mastery in our own house, and by virtue of our allegiance and submission to the rules of the European Union, we'd be able to master a globalized economy more effectively, and in that sense, have more sovereignty, not less. We did that. That was one gamble we made. But globalization has made the question of the extent and degree to which any, even successful democracy can be fully master in their own house, deeply, deeply problematic. This is not just a problem for small countries. It's a problem for a big G7 country. For a moment, let me speak as a Canadian. The question of what actual economic sovereignty we have over the terms and conditions of our national house are, it seems to me, the chief undiscussed issue in Canadian politics. The sense that our sovereignty is leaking, constantly leaking. The decisions made in Washington and also in China are eroding the capacity of a national community to decide basic things like its interest rates, employment rates, investment, all these things. Sovereignty has taken a tremendous battering as a result of globalization. This is even more the case with smaller countries. Now, at this point, one of the things that becomes apparent to me is the sense in which the Neo-Authoritarian challenge is picking up every single element that I have described as a discontent of liberal democracy. And this is why it's such a challenge. If we had a confident liberal democracy that provided and genuinely met the democratic ideal in terms of equality for individual citizens and mastery in our house in the second, if both of those ideals would be met, the neo-authoritarian challenge would not be a problem. It'd be a fringe movement that would die out. It's taking power because it's seized on discontents at the heart of the liberal democratic vision to which we don't have very good answers. Let me just pick out a few of these. One of the problems that the neo-authoritarians have a perfect pitch for is what Steve Levitsky calls vetocracy. That is the sense that the constitutional balances, the checks and balances that a liberal Democrat believes keeps us free, are rendering it impossible for democracies to be decisive in moments of crisis. The call for strong leadership, for an end to the parliamentary cretinism, where did we hear that before? An end of the kind of bickering, time for strong leadership, is playing at what many liberal Democrats are beginning to feel is a weakness. A United States that has essentially been politically paralyzed for about 15 years, occasionally squeaking out pieces of legislation. But it's paralyzed not simply because it's polarized, it's paralyzed because of James Madison. There's a problem in the design of liberal democracy, which is now a source of difficulty. A second problem that the neo-authoritarians have picked up on and is very uncomfortable is a sense in which the liberal gatekeepers, the judges, the lawyers, the university professors, the regulators, are corrupt self-dealers. Their self-justification is, we guard the guards to keep you free. And the neo-authoritarians are saying, don't believe it. All of these people are corrupt self-dealers, or they're purveying ideologies which are actively hostile to the interests of the majority. Universities are walking around telling you they're there to sift the wheat from the chaff. They're there to distinguish fake news from true fact. Don't believe them. What they're doing is using their ex cathedra authority, which the state gives them, to bully us into cultural and social views that we don't believe in. So their claim that they are a counter-majoritarian institution whose existence is to keep other people free is not right. They're misusing their power to bully us into positions on social and cultural and sexual issues which we don't agree with. Their counter-majoritarian claims are undemocratic. Only a liberal Democrat who's never been in a courtroom actually has much to say for the rule of law. I mean, throw that out I'm the world's greatest believer in the rule of law, except if you go into a criminal courtroom and see the seedy, decrepit quality of the justice we actually deliver to poor people. This erodes majority support for that thing called the rule of law. It empowers those who say our problem is judge-made law. Our problem is the courts have too much authority, right? So this is a second area in which the feeling that liberal gatekeepers have that their legitimacy is as counter-majoritarian counterweights to majority rule. The neo-authoritarians are going at that directly. You're a bunch of spoiled liberal dogmatists misusing the positions you have to defy the will of the majority. And the third thing they're saying is globalization has not worked for the people who vote for us. If you as a liberal wake up early in the morning wondering what kind of sovereignty even a successful liberal democratic state has, we do too. And we know what to do about it, which is to tell Brussels to get off our backs, to get out of trade arrangements that endanger the employment of our people, and put up as many walls around our economy as we possibly can. Not merely in the name of our prosperity, but in the name of our democracy. So we can recover sovereignty over the economic levers. You begin to see the ways in which the reason I take the neo-authoritarian criticism, and I'm trying to ventriloquize it, because I think sometimes it's good to take your helmet off and put someone else's helmet on, see what happens when you do. And some of the criticisms being made of the liberal democratic ideal are uncomfortably close to some of the criticisms that progressive liberal Democrats are making of the same system, but with very different outcomes. The outcomes, needless to say, for the neo-authoritarians are majority rule okay, counter-majoritarian institutions, get rid of them, reduce the effectiveness of representative democracy, make the relationship between citizen and power pass through the leader. So instead of having a lot of representatives, what you have is Viktor Orban, the incarnation of the country, right? There you have representation. Don't mock it. People feel represented by the leader, right? It's a solution to the sense that the representatives are powerless, the representatives are polarized, the representatives are incapable of taking decisions. Give it to a leader. And then you have a third element, of which we've seen a tremendous amount in Hungary. We take listening to the people very seriously. We consult them constantly. We ask them important questions like, is George Soros the source of all the evils in the state of Hungary, yes or no? This is a genuine consultation. Constant consultation, the use of a plebiscitary style of consultation is held to be democratic. It's extremely important that it's highly legitimized. And the other element of this, which we need to talk about with these neo-authoritarians, we call them neo, meaning they're new authoritarians, because one of the things that they make a great point of saying, which happens to be true, is unless I'm much mistaken, there's no police informer in this room. Unless I'm much mistaken, there are no political prisoners in Hungary. Unless I'm much mistaken, neo-authoritarianism does not depend on police terror, not yet. Again, this is part of the democratic credentials of this form of power. What do they substitute for police terror? Constant 24/7 media manipulation, domination of the cultural, spiritual, psychic space of a country. But where did they get that? They didn't get this from Stalin. They got this from Republican attack advertising in the United States of America. That is, they've taken technologies that have an absolutely perfect democratic credential and applied it to the problem of manufacturing consent in a situation where they've decided, again, for democratic reasons, not to use police terror to maintain power. So, boys and girls, this is a serious intellectual challenge. They are saying things about democracy that we are saying and providing solutions that I think are profoundly dangerous to the constitutional order of post-war Europe. So what do? I think, first of all, we need to do what Zsolt and his team are doing, which is think hard about what this is. This is a case where social science knowledge matters terribly. I put out some provocative ideas, and you may use them to junk them for the next 3 years. But the point is, we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about it free of a sense of. We need to take our helmets off. We need to put their helmets on. We need to think hard about how the world looks through their eyes, and I think then we will begin to. And some of the solutions to this problem are very dull and very traditional, it seems to me. On a day when Britain has just had the third or fourth prime minister in 40 days, it's a pretty urgent matter to get confidence back into liberal democratic government. It's not, you can't win a battle with neo-authoritarians if you have such staggering incompetence in a G7 country. It's not a minor matter. This stuff drains legitimacy out of the democratic experiment like water out of a bathtub, not just for the British, but for everybody else. You think, not to mention the contagion that imprudent fiscal policy in one G7 country can lead in other countries. So you want to have politicians who know how to make counter-majoritarian liberal democracy work. You want dull, stolid, competent, honest government. You need the demonstration effect of that critically. You need to have a reconceptualization of the liberal gatekeepers, their sociological position, their cultural authority. You need to think through why suddenly, first time in my lifetime, judges, professors, experts, regulators are so ferociously attacked. What is the intellectual, cultural significance of that? What is it about their roles that is driving people crazy in the name of a silent majority that is never heard? Why is it that in a British Parliament public debate in 2016, a highly educated cabinet minister says, "We've heard enough from the experts"? How did that start going? That's a new line. What is that about the liberal gatekeepers that is a source of an opportunity for neo-authoritarian attack? The biggest question of all is whether we can sustain open society, liberal democracy in an open, globalized economy. I hope that the research program will look carefully at economic policy, because this seems to me a crucial area in which neo-authoritarians are saying, where we need to shut ourselves off to maintain national sovereignty, we will do so. Then the question is whether that's viable at all. My sense is that this is the great unfolding challenge for liberal democracy, whether it can maintain a liberal democracy that is master of its own house within the globalized economy that we've currently created. I hope we can, but this is the bet that neo-authoritarians have made. We got to shut the door. We got to shut the door to foreigners. We got to shut the door to foreign business. We got to shut the door to everything to maintain sovereignty in our house. I've gone on longer than I intended. I've talked more than I should. I hope I've said something that gets an argument going. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We envisaged a break of 15 minutes or so, and then we would have a roundtable. We don't have time now for a proper question and answer section, but let me put myself in the shoes of an imagined Michael Ignatieff who sat on the benches listening to a speaker. I think I know what he would ask. So let me ask this one single question and then let you go. Most of the discontents of liberal democracy that you addressed and described have been around 20 years ago. Why now?
Great question. Great question.
Yours.
Some of it. You always say it's a great question when you're desperately trying to get some time. I mean, a historian would answer, this historian would answer, some of it's perfectly contingent. It's the demonstration effect of one successful regime, for example. Orban comes to power in 2010. Let's remember how one of the key drivers of his coming to power was disillusion with the previous government for its corruption and self-dealing, but also advanced disillusion with the ways in which the 2008 financial crisis laid bare just how dangerous a certain kind of globalization was to Hungarians. I mean, I've lived this in my own family. There were people who took out mortgages. They'd never taken out a mortgage in their lives and discovered to their horror it was denominated in Swiss francs. Austrian banks had sold them a mortgage and suddenly they were underwater. Orban comes in and says, this is a problem I'm going to fix. So there you see a kind of answer to your question. It's contingent on astute political leadership by a monstrously talented politician, so it's contingent, and it then sets in train demonstration, imitation down the line into Poland and Slovakia and elsewhere. But it is also conjunctural, that is, it also is inconceivable without a global financial crisis in 2008, which brought an end to 25 years of global expansion by demonstrating just how dangerous this expansion was when you were denominating mortgages in a country that had never had mortgages and were denominating in a currency like the euro or the Swiss franc. You put those two together and you begin to get something. But then you have to have a much bigger story about the United States. You have to have a big story, it seems to me, about a country slowly running into an ever deeper institutional crisis that it can't get out of. Again, there's no fatality here. It was a crisis that had solutions, but political leadership failed. But that then produces a sense of fatality. Nobody can fix this problem. We're too polarized. Madison locked us in chains. We can't get out. I think that accumulating crisis that I date from the mid-60s onwards, I mean, from Jack Kennedy's death onwards, I think the country has been in an institutional crisis, which has had ripple effects through the whole global system. 2008 is, I think, a hinge moment for everybody, because it then effectively puts paid to a kind of reboot of progressive liberalism in the Obama regime. It can't really do very much because of that crisis. So the crisis the 2008 crisis is an opportunity for the authoritarians, and it shuts down the response capability of the liberal progressive side. And then you'd have to factor in the Brexit story, how it is that a country that actually did extremely well out of the European Union is unable to be reconciled to the end of empire. It's just, you've got to factor in something that's completely strenuous, the enormous difficulty that European societies, particularly the British, but also the Europeans have, to understand something so basic to politics that you never think about it, which is, how big is my country? That's the primary question in politics. And the British thought, my country is very, very big. So I can play around with, 45 billion pounds of unfunded tax cuts and leave the world's largest trading economy because we're very, very big. When in fact, they're very, very small. And that failure of political understanding, you've got to put all these stories together to get a history story about why then.
Thank you. Thank you very much.